Welcome back, and welcome to those who weren't able to make it yesterday. I am Danielle McNamara, the Executive Director of the Learning Engineering Institute. I am very happy to welcome you to our second day of this wonderful conference celebrating learning engineering. And part of that is celebrating our keynote speaker, Punya Mishra, who is our director in the Learning Engineering Institute. He just accepted this position very recently at the beginning of July. And I gotta tell you, if you have not looked up Punya Mishra's website yet, you have not lived. It is an exploration in, it's just a weekly delight is what it is, in the kinds of things that he is doing in the land of education, technology, and creativity. So Punya's history began in electrical engineering. So how many of us in the room have some background in engineering? A good number. And so in electrical engineering, I think the key is making connections, electrical connections, and I think what he really missed was the fact that he wasn't making human connections. And so he abandoned electrical engineering and found his way to the field of education, and in particular connecting teachers and technology, and building technology and understanding how teachers can use technology. A key to Punya is creativity. And so I invite you to explore the many bios of Punya Mishra. It is a delight. Now, one of the best ones is the ones that he generated using ChatGPT, not recently, but last year, so at the very beginning of our explorations of ChatGPT. And I think you'll find it is wonderful. Now, and very funny. And so one of the key parts of this essay by ChatGPT, a description of Punya, is that apparently he's having an identity crisis. And I think that is just so descriptive of so many people in this room. The identity crisis that we have had in not really fitting into any field, but then finding learning engineering as our home. And in this, ChatGPT talks about learning futures. And so Punya has accepted the position and created his own title of Innovative Learning Futures, Director of Innovative Learning Futures. Now, the beauty of this title is you don't know where to attach the modifier to which noun. So it could be Innovative Learning Futures. It could be Innovative Learning Futures. You don't know. And the beauty of Punya is that he truly believes in creativity. And I think he did that on purpose so that you could creatively create what he's going to be doing. And so today, I think we're going to get an exploration of how learning engineering can be creative and how we can advance our missions. Now, I am so happy to bring Punya Mishra up to the stage, and I think you're in for a treat.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I need this. I had asked Daniel to set the bar low. That clearly absolutely failed, but thank you. That was very kind. Thank you, Icicle, for inviting me for this conference to give the keynote. That's how I feel. And there are two reasons why I feel that way. Is firstly, because in this weather, having anything called Icicle just feels good and right. And secondly, the theme of the conference is solving complexity at scale, which ASU is easily the best place where one can do things like solving complexity at scale. I mean, we have a project called Learning at Scale. Those are some of the numbers below of the number of students that are a part of either our, in person or in online and all kinds of ways in between. Now, I'll be honest, when I was asked, at this moment, I feel a little sense of pressure at being asked to give this keynote, because don't be fooled by that smile. When Danielle invited me, I was like, yes. And so, at the end of the day, my goal today is not to end up that way. As Danielle said, I have a new title with the Learning Engineering Institute. I'm very excited by that. Thank you for the shout out to my website. If you have a moment, read it, because I spend an inordinate amount of time writing for it, and I never know if anybody's reading it. Danielle spoke a little bit about my background, and I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. But my background is in engineering. From there, wanted to become a designer, filmmaker, ended up becoming an educator, researcher, working in educational technology, creativity design, all kinds of things. And I sort of call myself an educational systems designer, which is sort of a label that I sort of identify with, I think. I've also, of course, been a parent to 2 kids and have been a member of a school board. So over the past decades, have had a chance to look at education from all kinds of different directions, which is something that I will try to bring in our conversation today. So this idea of solving for complexity at scale is, and this is taken from the website description, which is focusing on the implicit complexity of learning challenges, from the individual tutor to MOOCs, I mean, everything in between, right? And this was a quote in a recent article by Ellen Wegner, which sort of really stood out at me, which spoke to sort of the inherent paradox in the work that we are all engaged in, which is learning is deeply, deeply personal. And I'll share quite a few stories from my personal experience about what learning has meant to me. But at some level, the ultimate goal that we really want to do is to be able to do it at scale. So how do we do this personal at scale? And I think the way I describe it, this is like an essential tension that we live with. And there's this wonderful book by Rohinton Mistry called A Fine Balance, and I always liked that cover of this kid balanced, on this little pole. And I think sometimes that's how I feel when we navigate these tensions that we live with. And so the title of my talk sort of builds on Thomas Kuhn's idea of essential tensions. So when he talks about scientific revolutions, between the tension between holding on to certain ideas that we have worked for us in the past, but at the same time recognizing that there are anomalies, there are issues that we need to be struggling with, and that tension is essential to the growth of science or of any field. And so, if you're giving a keynote, there is an essential tension there. Well, we want to keep it interesting, but also seeming at least insightful and wise, or at least sort of convey that, and not end up looking like that. So that's a fundamental tension in giving a keynote. So that's an essential tension. So the way I'll do this keynote is I will try to tell us a story, and a story, of course, is, narrative, usually prose, maybe true or maybe not, so who knows, right? So some of it may or may not be. But essentially with an idea of unpacking or thinking about this idea of complexity. And through that then sort of circle back to learning engineering and what does that mean for us. So there is of course an essential tension in storytelling as well, which is life is messy and complicated, and drawing a straight line from A to B is often not very straightforward, which when you think about it, is sort of like the learning design process. It sort of feels that way, you end up somewhere, it's like, okay, this is where we ended up. So I love Lewis Carroll, so I always try to use this quote. So where shall I begin? I said, start at the beginning, go until the end, and then you stop. So we shall see where this goes. So I'm going to start with this little place called Mizoram in the northeast of India. That's what I look like. And this is when I had hair. So Danielle, your comment yesterday really cut close to the bone. That whole discussion of hair, I have no idea what that was about. But anyway, so I was in this place called Mizoram in the northeast of India. And what was interesting about Mizoram, it's mostly Buddhist and Christian. And the kids there are obsessed with cowboys, at least when I was growing up. And they would all be sketching and drawing all the time. Westerns, cowboys, comics, and they would literally write and draw comics. And because of peer pressure, I would try to do the same, and everybody would make fun of me. So I wasn't very good at it. And it would have stayed that way, except that my father got transferred to New Delhi, and when we go to New Delhi, nobody there draws and sketches. And suddenly, even my random sketches, people were like, oh, Punya, have you seen his sketching? This guy's an artist. And I was like, oh, I am an artist. And suddenly I had this sort of identity that I could do things in the visual space. And I often wonder what my life would have been like if I had stayed in Mizoram. You know, because this became a part of who I am. I continuously sketch and draw even today, always doodling, you know, and so on. You know, I'm not a great artist, but I dabble in it. I have some confidence in it. And it makes me think that what we think is the foundation of learning is what we think is talent, what we bring into the world. And even that is fungible, that the talent is contextual. The talent, in my case of the visual arts, was based not on necessarily what I brought to the table, but also this transaction between me and the world. I think that's incredibly important for us as educators to think about. And then growing up in Delhi, I was an obsessive reader. The joke was that I would read the back of a toothpaste if I didn't have anything else to read. So I would read widely art, science, math, poetry, you name it. I want to highlight this one, Godel, Escher, and Bach, which I read back in high school, which was sort of my first introduction to this field called artificial intelligence. That's what sort of got me interested in psychology and so on. And we'll come full circle to that at some point. And in India, if you're good at science and math, you either become a doctor or an engineer. So I had my first brush with learning engineering, literally learning engineering, because I ended up at this place to get my undergraduate degree in electrical and electronics engineering. And I have called that my 4-year transformation, which looked somewhat like that. I went in 18-year-olds, highly enthusiastic. I was writing limericks about quantum mechanics. That's the kind of person I was. And in 4 years, the system just beat it out of me. Like all that was cared about was exams and tests back to back to back. There was no interest in understanding. There was no understanding of the fact that different people understand differently, learn differently, grow differently, develop differently. And so at the end of this 4 years, you know, I felt a complete failure. I felt like that I had gone in wanting to be a scientist, and I was like, no, I can't do it. I just don't have it in me. And so my first brush with learning engineering was pretty much a disaster. But again, I felt that I was interested in a wide range of things. I was interested in film, and I had grown up watching Ascent of Man and Cosmos, and you know, I was like, yeah, I love science, I love math, I'm interested in media, and of course I have talent because my father moved from Mizoram to Delhi, and I know I have some visual talent because of that. And so I joined a master's program in visual communications, wanting to make educational film. And that's where I was introduced to this idea of design. And that has been transformational in my life, this bringing together of technology and art and aesthetics and all of those things, of thinking about the natural world, whether it be fractals, falling in love with typography. So I do these kinds of visual word plays, which I hope it'll work. So that's the word fractal, which is designed in the shape of a fractal, right? And connecting it to sort of Indian architecture. And if you look at the architecture of Indian temples, you realize for a variety of reasons, those are actually fractals. And how these ideas come together and meet in beautiful and powerful ways was something that really sort of changed the way I see myself, I see the world. And then I met a special person, this guy. So that's me, again, with hair on the left, and that's one of my former students who then became the head of the department. He actually still had that in his office, so we got a picture taken with that Mac. And before that, you know, when I was in Pilani, I was actually programming with punch cards. I hated that. And then the Mac comes along, and the graphical user interface, and the fact that I could work in a transparent way with ideas, not with the computer, was a very transformational moment. And then discovering this thing, HyperCard. How many people here remember this thing called HyperCard? Thank you. Amazing piece of technology. And if you read Bill Atkinson and what he was thinking of when he developed that, it was transformational. The fact that I could write little snippets of code and work with this professor in electrical engineering was really, and so this is sort of what IDC felt like, right? Now, here is something that I want all of us to reflect on as we think about education, as we think about learning, that in 3 months, in the May of 1998, I was a failure. In the August of that year, right, May of 1998, this is how I felt like. And in 3 months, this intersection, I had found a community, I had found a history, I had found a field, a domain, something that I could grow and live in, right? And I had fallen in love with this idea of design. So to sum up this part of the story, so one of the things I talked about is this tension between talent and potential on becoming and belonging. 4 years in BITS Pilani, I never called myself an engineer. I was learning to be an engineer. I never was an engineer. 3 months in IDC, I was a designer. I called myself a designer. What's interesting there? I remember talking to this undergraduate student at Michigan State, where I was before, who was doing a double major in engineering and in music. And I said, in engineering, when the students meet, they do their homework, and they go their ways. He said, when I go to the music building, people are arguing about music. Somebody's practicing their scales because they see themselves as musicians. These guys see themselves as learning engineering. There's a thing about development of identity, of a sense of self with a domain, I think, that we need to be thinking about, right? And the value of being in discipline, that, that all these different things that I was interested in sort of now came together in this field of design. So anyway, jumping ahead, I ended up coming to Urbana-Champaign with an interest in working at this intersection of design and technology, and then this happened. I was a graduate student at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, where the first Mosaic browser was built. I have had a website since 1995, or I don't know, something like that. And then at some point, somebody told me, there is this thing called WebStar. I'm like, what is this thing called WebStar? He said, oh, you can make your own web server. I said, what does that even mean? So I fired up WebStar one day. This must have been like 1 a.m. I'm working in the lab. And it says, welcome to WebStar. I go to another computer, type in like 196.42. whatever, and this website page pops up. I go back, change one word. I remember I changed one word. And I came back, hit reload, and that word changed. And I knew at that moment that the world had changed, for me at least. Because now anybody could be a publisher. I could publish. I could write. And all these things that we've seen happen with social media and content creation, influencers, all of that, I knew, like that with the Mac, I knew that the world was different from me going forward. My life would be different. The web, I knew my life would be different. As it so happened, one of my friends presented me with this book called Discovering by Robert Root Bernstein. And in this book, it's a throwaway line. It's about scientific discovery, and it's sort of an idiosyncratic book. There's a passage where he says, oh, there are 400 different representations of the periodic table. And I'm like, what? There's one. That's the truth, capital T, on the wall. Mendeleev found it. And then I go start digging in, and you realize that chemists have been having a lot of fun. They have been really enjoying themselves. They have spirals, three-dimensional, this, that. And none of them are wrong per se. Just like every representation of the earth, whether it's a Mercator or a this or a that, those are right in some shape or form, conveying some idea. And so I got two key insights. One is that chemists are having a lot of fun, which we are denying to our students. Right? That's one. And the second, that there's this interesting interaction between the technology, the content, and the representation of it. So for instance, why are all periodic tables like this? Why are those two sets of elements, the lactinides and anthenides, sitting outside and not like this? And it's got everything to do with the technology of print. Because otherwise you'd have to print, a separate flap that costs more, blah, blah, blah. Fascinating. So I was like, now the web allows me to actually break that barrier, because I can zoom in, I can link, I can do all kinds of things with these different representations. So that's ended up becoming my PhD dissertation, which I developed this piece of software called Flips. It was a database running on FileMaker Pro with Macromedia Shockwave. I don't know how many even people remember Macromedia Shockwave and making it do all the jumps and tricks I was trying to make it do. Well, of course, all of that is now obsolete, right? None of that stuff works anymore. But in the act of designing flips, I remember having this huge argument with my committee because I wanted to write a chapter in my dissertation about the process of making flips, the designing of this piece of software. And they said, oh, you can write about it later, focus on the research study. And I sort of held my ground, and luckily for me, that I did, because that is the one chapter that has actually still stayed somewhat relevant. Because it speaks to these tensions that we deal with when we are thinking about taking a theory or a sense of ideas and instantiating it in a piece of software. And one of the things that I realized is that the design is always underdetermined by theory. Because there are many different ways that you can take a theory and instantiate it in a piece of software. Because some of it will depend on the constraints of the software, some of it will depend on the constraints of the medium. Right? Just like the periodic table and the book can be very different if it's periodic table and the internet, right? Because you can click on it and you can see a video about that element reacting with whatever, doing all kinds of things. So that brings me to summing up this part of the story. What I want you guys to take away is this intersection between ideas, its representation in these different media and technologies, that different media and technologies have different propensities, different strengths and weaknesses, and that as we think about how we create these tools or technologies and systems, that we need to think about that. That design, this act of going from thought to thing, plays a very critical role. Particularly with emerging technologies, because the ground rules have shifted, and maybe we're trying to apply rules from a different technology to this thing. And that's really tricky at times. And so that requires us to understand what this tech is in a deep way. And when we come to AI, I'll try to get into that a little bit. So anyway, our first child was born, which made it clear to me that I needed to graduate and get a job just to pay the bills, because I could have been a lifelong graduate student, the best life ever, except the money part. So I ended up going to Michigan State University. And one of the things at Michigan State, I sort of increasingly came to realize, I had gone in thinking that I'd be doing a lot more of this development of software, but realizing that getting that software into the hands of people, that the system that needs to be there for that, the structures that need to, I just didn't have those resources. And the tech keeps changing. Like I said, Flips was obsolete. Now I have to think of another one. And one of the advantages of being at Michigan State, because it's a great teacher prep program, I got to work a lot with actual teachers and educators. And that was sort of the transformational thing. So again, bringing this idea of design to now teacher preparation, thinking of designing of processes, designing of experiences, instead of designing of artifacts, which is like a piece of software. So did a lot of work around thinking about teachers as being designers, work that influences everything I do even today, that teachers are agents, are active agents. Too often I see technologies as being, we can sidestep the teacher, and I don't think that works necessarily. I also had the good fortune to run across this gentleman, Matt Kaler. As you can see, very cool with glasses, also without glasses. So Matt and I have a wonderful, he's, I think, my closest friend and colleague. Funny story being that when he applied to come to Michigan State, he had a ponytail, and I just didn't like the ponytail. I was on the search committee. I was completely against Matt getting the job. We often joke about what would have happened if I had my way. I was the junior most faculty on the search committee. They just ignored me, thankfully. And Matt and I have had this amazing collaboration over the years. He is completely the opposite of me, big white guy from Wisconsin, vegetarian, all that kind of stuff, very introverted, analytic. I am this like goofball bouncing off the walls, and I think the partnership that we developed was truly most amazing collaborative relationship I've ever had. So we ended up developing this thing called the TPACK framework, which some of you may be familiar with. If you Google me, that's what comes up the most, which is kind of sad that you are known for a Venn diagram. But it gets cited a lot, so I'm totally fine with it. So it gets cited a lot. But more importantly, I think it's been very influential in how colleges of education and professional development look at teacher preparation and teacher professional development in the area of technology. So that to me has been very, very significant. And in particular, the fact that around 800 dissertations have used this as a foundational framework, I think speaks to the fecundity of the framework and the way it has allowed people to ask good questions. And I think that's and whether it's not, I have my criticism of the framework as well. So it's not about the framework being right, but the framework being something that at least you can push against, and then you can have data, you can talk about it in intelligent ways. So as that was happening, I was also directing a master's program in educational technology. So I've talked about designing artifacts like pieces of software, designing processes, and started really thinking about that learning is happening as an educative experience. What does it mean to design an experience? And John Dewey has this great quote that all education happens through experience, but not all experiences are equally educative. And so I started thinking a lot about sort of problem-based learning around creativity and open-ended structures. These are teachers working in this project we had in Chicago. And started really thinking a lot about this role of creativity and aesthetics as they play out in learning. So I had a sort of a sideline of research on looking at like how scientists or practitioners in many fields talk about what motivates them. And it's rarely, if ever, money and salary, especially in scientists and mathematicians and so on. They will talk about the beauty of ideas, whether it's in writing code. There's this lovely book called Beautiful Code. And very often in education, we don't have words or language to talk about these things seem very intangible. So I've done some work on sort of thinking about what the role of this aesthetic can be. What does it mean? And how can it be generative? And also, creativity has been a constant thread. This is a series of articles that we've been writing, like we put out one every 2 months. It's sort of like a column that we write for the journal Tech Trends, and has been just an awesome experience, because there's nothing like every 2 months having to turn in 4,000 to 5,000 words, which makes sense, which are coherent and insightful and so on. Led to some work on sort of developing an instrument for how one can look at a physical space, whether it is conducive to creativity or not. More recently, Dana Hendrickson and I and Lauren Wu have written a piece where we are taking this framework, this sort of structure, and seeing what does it mean for online or hybrid spaces. Sort of work in progress. And when I think about what it means to have an educational experience, I also think about the opposite of what it is to have a terrible educational experience. If you think about during the pandemic, my daughter was a student, she was at home. We didn't have enough space because our house was not set up right. And so she would come in and say, I have to give my exam, can you leave? And then she would have to take a picture of the whole room. And what are we telling our students through that? That we start with the assumption that you're going to cheat. How can that be an experience that is valuable, meaningful to them, right? So I think those are the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about. Around the pandemic also, I did a seminar on measuring what matters, asking this question of, do we measure what we value, or do we value what we measure, right? And I think that's a really important question to ask, because if you are interested in, if a student is seeing beauty in mathematics, how do we even measure that? And again, I'm not saying that throw everything out because we can't measure X. However, as a field, we need to be asking ourselves these questions. What are we missing? What are we not talking about? What is hidden? What are we blind to? I think that's really important. All right, so summing up this part, it's the complexity of designing, of artifacts, processes, and experience, but also a nagging feeling as I was working with teachers and working with schools, thinking about existing technologies, how to modify them, that it wasn't making the kind of change that I would like to see. And the kids were the right age, and so I ended up coming here to ASU 8 years ago. If you didn't know already, we are the #1 in innovation. We put it on every bus and hoarding in town. If you haven't seen it yet, ask for your money back. Because I joke and I say, this is what I call a mandatory slide. If I don't give it, my boss is going to dock my salary or something. But what ASU let me do gave me an opportunity to go from thinking about designing artifacts, processes, experience to thinking about broader systems and culture. So I was very lucky early on. This was just one of those things of happenstance, that there was some money that was there that I could hire a group of people who became educational designers. And we started working with schools and school districts in spaces this big with hundreds of educators, community members, children, students, asking questions about what is high school for, what does high school mean. You know, learned a lot through that process about like who is at the table and who is not. So the first time we did this, there were 2 tables we had set aside for Hispanic parents with translators and everything, and nobody showed up. And they didn't show up because they never felt that they were included in this conversation. So we had to go out to the community. We had to go to evening English programs and then get feedback from there. So I learned a lot through that process. And one of the proudest thing, I mean, you know, I showed that slide of lots of citations. Yes, that is good. But the thing that I think I'm most proud of, that ASU allowed me and gave me the chance to do, is the school that we designed from bottom up in the neighborhood Skyline School District. And that was something special. We took what were 4 classrooms, literally broke down the walls. You have this open space. It's open not just in terms of kids moving around, but it's open to the community, parents and others coming in. It's a resilient community, and the reason I can say that is when COVID happened, the whole school district went with a policy of having a head teacher you know, do video lectures, and the other teachers, like the good teachers do video lectures, and others would sort of just offer support. And this school pushed back, and they said, no, no, no. We have formed relationships with our families. If some random person comes and gives even a good talk, it's going to destroy the relationship that we have formed. Can we do something different? And they were given permission to do something different. So they were not prepared for the pandemic, just as none of us were, but they were resilient because I think the design of the system allowed for that. So some of my more recent work with colleagues, just Melissa Warr, Kevin Close, and others, has been around thinking about the role that design plays across these different spaces in education. So, you know, I've talked through artifacts, processes, experiences, systems, and culture. And so, in some weird way, my life so far has been sort of spanning across that, or it's post hoc, 2020 vision, whatever, you know, storytelling could be that too. And starting to think about sort of technological change being sort of ecological nature, and I can talk a little bit more about that. So summing up till this part, you know, design and education, artifact systems, processes, all that sort of stuff. And then more recently in November, so things were sort of steady state. I was doing my stuff. And then this happens. Somebody told me that, like, where's the F? So I made it clear. There is an F in there, so shift happens. And that was in November of 2022 when this creature popped into our lives. And if you go to my website, like Daniel said, I have been obsessed with this creature since, I think, a little before then, but it has. And the fact of the matter is that it has been around and with us for a while. It is in all of these tools and technologies that we use. But suddenly there's this plethora of other species which have invaded our ecosystem. And of course, when the first thing came out, it was the end of education as we know it. You know, the school, college essay is dead, blah, blah, blah. And then we had the other side, which is like, oh, no, it is going to transform education. It's going to be good. How do we embrace it? How, you know? And then, of course, came the hype that, oh, this is going to change the whole world. And, you know, like, this chatbot is going to teach you everything, right? All of that. And I think at some level, fundamentally misunderstanding what this technology is. So I want to spend a little bit of time going back to this point I had made earlier, that we need to understand what a particular technology is, what it does, what it doesn't do. So what is it and how does it differ from other technologies? So first of all, if you ask DALL-E, what does AI look like? It's a young woman with funky stuff on their head. Don't ask me why that gender, don't ask me why the funky stuff on the head, but that's what it is. But as my colleague Sean Leahy told me, this is what Gen AI actually looks like. It's banks and banks of servers doing computation. So I think one of the basic errors that happened early on, and I will blame the big companies for sort of pushing that narrative, was that AI is a search engine, that it is a truth machine, that if you can ask it questions, it'll give you the right answers, and it's an oracle. And I think that large part of the issues we are dealing with right now is trying to get our head out of that bucket into a different bucket. So what is it? You know, people have called it a stochastic parrot, and I get that, but I think that's limiting in some ways. I think through these large language models, which are being trained on large data sets, that it is forming not equivalent to the conceptual structures we have in our head, but it is forming some higher order abstractions, and I can give some examples of what I think it is. And so it is generative. Every conversation that you have with it, interaction you have with it, is almost ab initio. It's new, it's brand new, it's building. It's not looking up the answer and giving it to you. It is multimodal. So I have a lecture on my website, which is entirely generated by AI. So it's me speaking with an AI-generated voice, AI-generated words, and it can work across these multiple modalities. And I think this is one, and hopefully you can come to the session Nicole Oster and I have tomorrow, where we sort of dig into this aspect a little bit more about it being a conversational dialogical partner in its use of natural language, in its sort of turn-taking, in its use of certain stylistic tics that humans have. It becomes a dialogic partner in some way. And so as I've been playing with it over the last couple of years, there's lots and lots of examples. These are all on my website, so I won't go too much into them, but I'll give this example of the Euclidean coincidence one, where I asked it to write, many years ago, I had written a poem which was the proof of the infinity of primes, just because I could write, to see if I could write it as a poem. So I did that, and then I was like, oh, how could ChatGPT deal with it? And so ChatGPT did a decent job. First time, I think it got some math wrong, and I would point it out, and I'd say there's something wrong there. I said, oh, you're right, fixed it, came up with a decent poem. Then I started thinking, how cool would it be if I could flip this and make it an educational task? So I said, put an error in the logic of the proof in your poem, just to test what ChatGPT would do. And it did it. And what's fascinating is that it identified an error that humans tend to make. In fact, I have linked to websites which have made the same error. These are math websites which have made the same error. And so when people say this is a stochastic parrot, and I push back a little bit, because think about what needed to happen. It has to, A, quote unquote, imagine air quotes every time I use a word which is sort of anthropomorphic. It has to understand the proof. It has to understand the rules of poetry and rhyming and so on, and map those two together. Not just that, it now has to understand the kinds of mistakes humans make with this proof through its training or whatever, and then subtly insert that mistake into that poem and do that within seconds. That's pretty insane when you think about it, right? And so I don't think it is just a stochastic parrot. It has formed some abstractions of what poetry is, what a proof is, what this is, what that is, and sort of is able to create things. So it gives us all kinds of superpowers. We have our faculty in our college using it for qualitative research. I don't know how to write code in Python, and I have a working program in Python that people have actually emailed me and asked me, and I've sent it to them, so now I'm a coder? No. This was a simulation that I created of Gay-Lussac's law, just plain English, like, oh, I want you to create this, where if I raise the temperature, I think balls will bounce harder, and then the pressure on the sides will go up. Can you do that? It was half an hour of me goofing around. I don't know Python, I don't know any of this stuff. And I write in my blog that a middle schooler can do this because it's written in English. That program was written in English, and I think that's a really powerful tool, and I don't see enough educators sort of thinking about what we can do with these tools now. It can now, of course, see and hear. A couple of examples. The one on the right is a picture of an eclipse I took when I was a doctoral student at Urbana-Champaign. It's a picture of the ground with the sun's light coming through the leaves, little pinholes. I gave this picture, asked it what it is. After one round, it basically said, oh yeah, it's a solar phenomenon, it's an eclipse. I said I was a grad student in Urbana-Champaign in the 90s. It gave me the date and the time possibly that the picture was taken. That's just crazy when you think about it. I remember doing this and I was like, I can't believe that it did that. But at the same time, it is super weird. It is weird because, this is how humans, we form our mental and internal and external representations. We look at reality through our senses, we form these representations, and we take those and we make theories and movies and poetry and diagrams and sketches. Those are the external representations, which then feed back into the reality we live in. That's how we lived for the longest time, till LLMs come along, where they take a subset of those external representations and create some representations within their own self. The biggest challenge, of course, is that there is no connection of that LLM to the real world. Our representations are continuously being tested against the real world. And even then, we make up all kinds of stuff, which is amazing when you think about it. Now, this is completely unmoved from it. And so I wrote this post, I think a year or 2 years ago, that ChatGPT is essentially a bullshit artist. And some philosophers recently wrote an article about that too. And I was like, you didn't cite me. I felt bad. Because I had written it before. But, and they do too, use the word bullshit not in the sort of colloquial sense, but in the sense of Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher, who says that somebody who bullshits is not interested in the continuum of truth to falsehood. We all know politicians who are that way, maybe some colleagues as well, right? That continuum is not of interest to them. It is word salad. You know, it's almost like we are living in Derrida's dream, right? Where word texts are everything and they all are referring to each other, but there is no reference to the real world. And so when you think about what LLMs do, increasingly I've come to realize that it has to hallucinate because that's all it really does. And so this idea that we can get rid of the errors that it makes, I just don't think that it's inherent in the technology. And instead of trying to push against it and drown it out, of course we need to put guardrails and so on for like the most egregious kind of crap it can throw at us. But rather than that, to see it for what it is, that it is this generative, quote unquote, creative partner possibly. So when I see news items like this, I'm always blown away. It's like, why are we still surprised? Why are we surprised that Google search engine started manipulating history? You can control for 1,000 prompts, there's 1,001th prompt, which will make it crash again. And then it'll make headlines again. I mean, I love playing with it, so I don't know if you've ever tried doing scientific diagrams with ChatGPT. They are absolutely the best. The level of reality, like they get the surface idea of what a scientific diagram should look like, and they get everything else wrong. It's hilarious. Like that is the design. I asked it to do the Stanford design model, IDEO design model. Just look at those sticky notes. It looks so perfect, except it's garbage. That's the TPAC framework. It's fabulous. So I had my dog do all kinds of things that it has never known that he could do. But generative AI is weird in other ways as well. And when I say weird, I use it in the term that I used in social psychology, which is that most psychological studies have been done on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. And almost bulk of the data on which these systems are trained on are the same way. So it'll do simple things like it'll take my accent. And I have an Indian accent. Indians listen to me now and they say, oh, you have an American accent. That's not true. It's a weird amalgam of both, because I've lived here long enough now, right? But that's key to who I am, to my identity. And there are these programs out there which, without informing me, will give me a vaguely British accent, which I've heard is great for my credibility, because British accents are more credible. There are websites out there which will fix my accent for me, right, on the fly. So I'll be talking to you, and there will be a button I can press here, and I'll come out, strangely enough, Midwestern. So even what an American accent is getting flattened. I think those are important things for us to think about. AI has a hotness problem. So I entered this picture on the bottom left. Nicole Oster is here somewhere, so based on an idea that she came up with. And I said, describe it in 1,000 words. And I put the description back, and I said, recreate it. And look at the images it recreates. All the people in that are perfect. And when we think about the research that we have, the evidence that we have, the tools like Instagram and so on have been incredibly harmful to teenagers, particularly girls, around self-image and so on. And what does it mean to live in a world where every image that we generate is perfect? I tried this with my son, who's a very good-looking Indian origin young man. And this is what ChatGPT said he should look like. I sent this to him, and I was like, this is what I had ordered. What did I get you? No, I didn't do it. It's very, very Aryan, that's all I can say, right? And some of the research that my colleague Melissa Warr has been doing is just incredible, looking at bias. So we can see examples of bias when you say, draw a doctor and it'll show a white person or something like that. But this is the point I was trying to make, that these systems, you cannot 100% guardrail. So here is an example where she had a lot of evidence to show that if you told the AI that this essay was written by a black student versus a white student, it actually score them equally or score the black student higher. But the scores would flip if you say inner city versus private school. So it had been guardrailed against explicit descriptions of race, but not against implicit. But then she did something even more amazing. So all this is on our website, so you can go take a look. Gave a passage where a student talked about how they learn, how they get ready to take an exam or something like that. Snuck in between is this innocuous sentences like, as I am getting my notes ready, I like to listen to some rap music, and as I blah, 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 and it goes on. In other cases, it's classical music. It's never explicitly called out. It is never said this student is this or that, nothing. And that's enough to make a difference in the score that this AI will give across models. It's enough to change the language that it uses for the student and the feedback that they give. In one case, for the classical student, it gives the feedback it gives at a 9th grade level. For the rap student, it gives feedback at the 8th grade level. So implicit bias emerges despite the guardrails. So generative AI is in fact weirder than weird. So these are some examples. It does better when you give emotional prompts. You say, my job depends on it. I won't graduate if I don't get this right. I think they have guardrail for this one now, but there was a time when if you'd say, I will give you a $20 tip, it'll actually work harder for you. Asking you to take a deep breath, it's hilarious. This stuff is, you can't make this stuff up, right? This one is my favorite. So if you change your system date and it thinks you're in May versus December, the performance changes. And here's the thing, as people catch these developers go in the back and they tweak that. They're like, oh, if it asks for a date, don't change your whatever. But it's a Band-Aid. It's not changing the fundamental nature of this guy, right? And so this is, if I joke about like if my tombstone, this is what I want, that I came up with this, that ChatGPT is a smart, drunk, somewhat biased intern. And if you keep this in mind, you can actually be you can have a great time with it because it's available, it's always there, right next to you. It has expertise quite deep in certain ways, quite weird in other ways. But if you see it this way, recognize that it could be biased, recognize this, you can actually use it in very productive ways. So you can think of it as an alien intelligence that is a thought partner. And so there are lots of examples that we can think of. Our colleague here, Ron Bagetto, has been thinking of AI as like a possibility engine, as a Socratic opponent. Think in each of these, think about this, the idea that it hallucinates is actually seen as a strength. Right? You are sort of embracing what the true nature of this technology is, not making it be something that it is not. Also want to just briefly mention, I don't want to go into this in detail, that's another talk altogether, but I also am deeply concerned about some of the broader impact on our sort of world with these new technologies, as we see with social media, what its impact has been. I wonder what happens when creating absolute, genuine looking fakes and so on becomes a part of our life, right? And so because AI does not work in a vacuum, it enters a world that's racked already by a history of racism, sexism, xenophobia, you name it, right? And it's going to be in that working within economic systems which value engagement over caring for you or whatever, right? And it's within this. So when we think about what we are doing as educators, we sort of really need to start thinking broadly about understanding the system, understanding the broader culture, and how we can design within it. All right, so long-winded way to get back to our original question, which is, how do we resolve this paradox? And what I was trying to do with the stories that I gave of my life is this one story, right? It's one person, then it's one journey. Each of you, which is what I love when I meet people for the first time or airplanes, I will ask them, how did you end up doing what you're doing? And it's so interesting. Everybody's life is this weird idiosyncratic dance between coincidences and chance encounters with people. Talents recognized, talents not recognized, talents supported, opportunities missed. It's just fascinating. And then when we think about it scale, each of these individuals is bouncing along like Brownian motion, and you're trying to sort of craft that into something which is bigger. And that's tricky. So why then is learning engineering one possible answer to this thing? So I'm going to make a quick digression. All of us have seen this in high school textbooks, sort of Bernoulli's principle applied to how planes fly. So you must have all seen diagrams like this, that the wind comes along and then the upper side of the wing is more curved, so the air goes along a longer thing and the one below goes quicker, and there is a change in pressure, so that's how you get the lift. Well, it turns out it's wrong. And I was as shocked as many of you maybe, or if you didn't know this before. That's not how because that doesn't explain how planes can fly upside down, because then they'll just go crashing, whatever, right? And it's a much more complicated story and so on. But planes still fly. And, if you think about, this is the box that the Wright brothers had made, the wind tunnel, on which they tested their different models. So if you think about it, they used data. Data was important. They had weird, naive theories, most probably, of how this thing works. Clearly if we didn't understand it today, we clearly didn't understand it 100 years ago. They created models, they tested them, creating prototypes, with the end result of trying to get something that works. And so that's the end of my digression. So why learning engineering is one answer to some of these things that I've talked about, and education is a teeny-weeny bit more complicated than flying an airplane, trust me. And that's complicated enough. It is what people have called a wicked problem, which is, I won't necessarily get into that right now. But what learning engineering to me, and I want to be very clear, this is my take on it. As Daniel said, I'm a new entrant into this space, trying to figure out that the work we are engaged in is essential. This is essential work. This is the work of developing the future of who we are as a species, right? All of us educators across the world, that's what we're engaged in, whether in this room or wherever you may be. But recognizing also that it is really messy and complicated, and that at some level pragmatism, that's what, to me, what engineering brings, is this sort of pragmatic approach to life, which is like, how can I get it to work? It's human-centered, because we are building these things for us. It's eclectic. At some level, to me, getting something to work, you don't care where the theory is coming from. Is it coming from psychology or sociology or political science? If it is useful to what I am doing, wonderful. And so that automatically makes us interdisciplinary. We have no choice but be, because the problems we tackle don't fit in small, clean buckets. We are driven by theory and data, because how else can we make assumptions? How else can we make hypotheses? But I think there is a humility to that as well, that theory is never, or data is never going to determine every move that we make in that space. That school district that we worked with, that the school that we designed, I had no data, no theory. I was running on instinct. And if I had theories, it was about, if I have to work with that organization, I have to treat the people there with respect, which is, as a theory, is like as basic as it can get. Or my job as the associate dean there was to continuously calm people down, because things were going wrong left, right, and center. It went up to a vote in the school board where one person said, I love this project, but I can't vote for it because I'm standing for election next year. It's complicated. And so I had to bring whatever I knew together and try, to work that to the best. And for Kyrene, every project like Kyrene that I can boast of, I can talk about 5 more which completely flopped, despite our best efforts, because it is messy and complicated. And I think the other thing is this thing, that shift happens. Like till November, ChatGPT was not a thing, AI was not a thing. I really don't think it is what people say it is. But the fact of the matter is, whole world has gone bonkers over it. If we don't talk about it, if we don't look at it, if we don't tell people what it really can do or think of ways of making it do that it can really do, we are also letting our responsibilities down, right? So shift will happen, all right, we have to deal with it. And so to me, when I think about sort of this definition of learning engineering, all of those words to me come together in this thing of wanting to make things happen and to approach that with humility, because we could be wrong. Because in a complex system, and yesterday this was talked about, one thing here can lead to something really terrible or wonderful happening somewhere else. And so recognizing that tension, so this is, I think, a really to me, this is the foundational tension of any practice-oriented field, because we come from academia where we love theory, we love data. And there is an implicit looking down upon the practitioner. Whether we like it or not, it is there. And then we look at the practitioner and they look at us and there's an implicit looking down on us. Like, oh, they live in this airy-fairy world. Walking that, navigating that fine balance, I think, is the biggest challenge that we face as a field. And I have no simple answers to offer to that, except that this is not a new challenge. So here are some examples of quotes that I really love, or ideas that have sort of, to me, held this test of time, about sort of understanding the materials and how we make meaning from them. This is one of my favorite quotes. This is from Alan Kay, where he says, as with most media from which things are built, whether the thing is a cathedral, a bacterium, a sonnet, a figure, or a word processor, or we could say a learning management system, architecture dominates material. To understand clay is not to understand the pot. What a pot is all about can be appreciated better by understanding the creators and users of the pot and their need to both inform the material with meaning and to abstract meaning from the form. That's a really, really powerful quote. And then I go back in time to Vitruvius, who, when he talked about architecture and what buildings should have, by the way, he is the inspiration behind the Da Vinci's famous sketch that is called the Vitruvian Man. He says that architecture, any successful piece of architecture, needs to have firmness, utility, and delight. Firmness as in it's stable, like, a breeze comes along, it can't just fall down, right? What does that mean for the systems we create, whether technical systems or whatever the systems? Utility, obviously, it needs to perform the function. But I love the use of the word delight. Like, how often do we talk about delight when we talk of a learning management system? Usually it's the opposite. Like, oh my God, I have to work with Canvas again. Like, I can't believe how many hours I spent just fixing this one thing, right? And if we have to think about these things, I think it's really important that what is it that we need to know as a field. So for this one, I go back to this Samargana Sutradhara, which was this book supposedly written by this King Bhoja back in the 11th century. Turns out that he was like one of those, people who run massive labs and get postdocs and grad students to do all the work and put their name on it. Most probably that was what was going on there. However, in chapter 44, the attributes of a sthapati, which is the Sanskrit word for architect, he says, one who is well versed in theory alone but is not trained in practice will faint at the time of action like a coward on the battlefield. Goes on to say, similarly, one who is expert only in his workmanship but does not know the theoretical aspects will, like a blind man, be misled by anyone. So this thing I was talking about, theory and practice, 11th century. But the third thing that he says that I did not mention, however, one who is knowledgeable is still not preferable, even though equipped with all of these, if he is lacking in character. And to me, that's the magic scissors that cuts that knot of how do we make decisions when theory and data are under determining design. It's judgment. And how we develop that judgment, how we develop that inner gyroscope, that's hard. And I think that's incredibly important. So this idea of sort of foundational values that we bring to the table becomes critically important. And Mei, which should point her out now, is going to answer all the questions that come from this slide onwards. So this idea of principled innovation that Mei so eloquently talked about yesterday, and will tell you more if you ask her. Thinking about intellectual, moral, civic, and performance, and how that aligns with what it is that we do. I'm just giving her a hard time because she just randomly mentioned me yesterday. So. And to me, that's sort of the challenge for us as a field. This was a mantra from Facebook, move fast and break things, and we all know how that ended up. And so I think for us to think about moving intentionally and nurturing things, and hopefully in that process, leaving it better. We are done. Thank you very much. Just a quick shout out to the AV team in the back. Yesterday, I came up to them with like a random request of how I wanted the tech set up, and they've been amazing. Thank you guys, made the whole thing very seamless. Anything with PI goes to Mei. Everything else is fine.
Wow, outstanding talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm Wendy Walsh, and I'm with the United States Air Force. I'm really excited about the AI as a dialogue partner, and I'd love to hear more about what you're imagining with that. I notice a lot with our leaders that we don't spend a lot of time practicing how to have a dialogue with each other. And so I've been, sharing books and other literature. We learn how to have a dialogue when someone's in trouble, when things have gone poorly. We learn a little bit about how to manage other people, but not so much that idea of nurturing people with a dialogue. And how do we do that sort of thing? And so as you were talking, I'm thinking, is this an environment for us to practice and learn how to have more of that caring dialogue that also helps us to facilitate learning and to get our mission done?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for the kind words and the question. So I'll approach it two ways. Rizwana is here in the back, and we've been looking at, for instance, how one can have sort of quote-unquote difficult conversations and simulate them with any Gen AI system, right? So let's say if you're a teacher, one of the things that students have misconceptions, but until you step into a classroom, you never really encounter a misconception, and you don't know how to deal with it. Right? Or if you're a principal and you have a teacher who's not, you haven't had a chance to practice those kinds of conversations. So you can use these for ChatGPT very easily. The prompts are pretty straightforward. They are quick. You can give them different personalities if you want, and so on. So that's one way of sort of thinking about, as long as you're aware of the fact that this is not a real person, and and so on and so forth. And that's really hard to do. One gets emotionally invested in this. So that's one aspect of that. The other aspect, which I think is more long-term, which is like where it's a little concerning for me, is the nature of our interaction with the medium influences the nature of our interaction with each other, right? I mean, we can see this with, let's say, Twitter or X and so on, where the anonymity of it and so on is very easy to behave in ways that are inappropriate with each other that we'd never do face to face. And I often wonder how that plays out in an AI space, and then what flip influence that has on us as how we interact with each other. I'm blanking on her name. Sherry Turkle has written, she has a great piece based on her talk where she talks about the friction of human relationships which is like developmentally and so on, that the fact that we will not agree with each other on everything, that we have to guess each other's intentions and we get it wrong sometimes, and that leads to disagreements, is a critical part of what it means to grow up and be human. What does it mean to live in a world where these bots will always acquiesce to you, like, oh, you are the best. I love hearing that, don't get me wrong. But there are times when I also need to be told when I'm wrong or when I'm this, right? So yeah, I think it's a complicated thing, but I think that the work that Rizwana and I have sort of done points to, in small cases, that it becomes a great, quick and easy way of practicing different kinds of social scenarios, which otherwise you would have to actually learn on the job, so to speak, which could have negative consequences, which in this case you wouldn't. Microphone.
Hi, I'm Bror Saxberg. I've done learning engineering for quite a long time. I'm curious, from a systems perspective, so valuable, as you said, to have teachers begin to think more of themselves as designers, as applying theory and evidence-based principles, but also in the real world of practice and context. Do you have any insights or thoughts from a system standpoint of how to get schools of education and school districts to move to that, to try to shape a generation of learning designers instead of a generation of the teachers with the way they are right now?
Well, I think that's a huge challenge issue, but one of the things that I've sort of written a little bit about and I've thought about, particularly with Melissa Warr, it's funny, like if you ask like a teacher in a K-12 district, where does the money to run your classroom come from? They have no idea, right? They have no idea of the broader system which is supporting. And I'm not saying that they need to become administrators, that's not the point I'm making, but I think that we really don't understand. I mean, speaking of higher ed, I'd been a faculty for like N years when I was at Michigan State. I thought I knew how universities function till I come to ASU and I'm given this title of associate dean and I'm working at a different, I'm like, oh my God, faculty don't have a clue. And I don't mean it in a bad way. I love them. I'm one of them, right? But they really don't understand this enterprise. And I'm sure Danielle, as executive director, has a view of things that I don't fully understand. And then Michael Crow, but again, I don't need to become Michael Crow, but I need to understand that there are broader systemic things that are constraining, allowing, permitting moves that can be made in that space, right? And so one way of thinking, the way I think about sort of design across like artifacts, so if you're thinking about artifacts, if you're designing a software, you're thinking about the user for sure, you're thinking about the code and how to make it more efficient. My wife's a graphic designer. So when she's talking about something, she's talking about fonts and weight and balance. We interviewed Michael Crow, my students interviewed Michael Crow. He's working like a designer too, except his palette is different. And I think having people even just become sensitive to that, I think goes a long way towards at least understanding that there is a bigger narrative here within which we are sort of playing this game. I think that's one thought that we've had that we've, I think, written a little bit about.
This working? Yeah. Hi, I'm Liza Loop. I came from California, and I don't know whether I'm a learning engineer or not. I came here to find out. You made a comment about the poem that you wrote, and you intentionally put in a mistake, and ChatGPT got it wrong. How do we know when ChatGPT is wrong? What do you have to know in order to, and is it important that human beings can recognize when the AI gets it wrong?
I didn't catch the first part of the question, but I think the question is, how do we know if ChatGPT is wrong and does that matter? I don't think we'll ever 100% know, just like you don't know how much of the stories I told you were made up. Right? I mean, I fudged some details here and there for narrative, whatever, right? I mean, so that's just part of life, is the point I'm trying to make, is that we are never 100% sure of all the facts. And if we had to be critical thinkers for everything, we would not function. We'd be like that centipede who's trying to figure out which leg should go where. It's not going to go anywhere, right? So some level of trust and faith and all that is important. At the same time, we also need to recognize what this technology is, and that it requires a higher level of critical scrutiny if we are asking it for facts. If I'm asking it for a citation, I have to check. I know this, right? And so anybody who submits a journal article where the citation is made up by GPT, like, come on. Are you still in 2022, right? But there are other aspects where in a friend and a colleague, we appreciate their goofiness, their little whimsicality. If we approach GPT that way, that's fine, because we are not taking what it's reporting to us at face value, right? So I think depending on the purpose, it's going to be different. I think that the goal to get rid of all errors from it, maybe that's possible. I'm not enough of an expert to say it's not, but it's going to be a very bland and dull and uninteresting character to hang out with. So somewhere the temperature setting needs to be where it's engaging and fun, but that comes at the risk of it making stuff up, you know? So it's that, I think, yeah. And again, I think that that setting can be different for different purposes. Like the setting is different, for instance, for Google than it's for Meta. Because Google's brand is about like getting you the right answer. Meta's brand is social engagement. For them, a goofy bot is great. So I think it depends is the academic answer, and that's what I've given you.
Thank you for your talk, Punya. Really appreciate it. I think bias gets a bad rap. And I like bias. I like it in my tires. And I also like it in the people I work with all the time. And that really determines sort of who they are. I think the problem is when bias is not made explicit and when we don't bring that out. Can you talk about how we're grappling with bias in AI, and particularly as it relates to education and maybe some of the strategies we can use to take advantage of bias and not be so worried about it?
Thank you for that. Not sure I have a completely thought-through response to that. So the way we think about bias is that these large language models are basically, since they're trained on us, take on us, right? They are us through a mirror darkly. And the part that concerns me is this use of this technology for high stakes, sort of like student assessments, right? Where the kind of feedback it's giving. Because we never know. So the example that I give is as follows, that if the AI system, let's say Khanmigo, asks you, where do you teach? It's part of its information that it takes from you. And you say, I teach in inner city Detroit. And somebody else says that I teach in wherever Mitt Romney went to school, Country Day, right? We will never know the fact those two teachers are getting different kinds of feedback, that the students are getting different kind of feedback. That worries me. If there was transparency in that, I'd be fine with it. Like if I could know where this is coming from, that would be okay. We don't. And again, what we are finding is same model, based on an update, completely different responses. So there is no stability to that. Different models, different responses. So what is a lack of transparency on part of a lot of the companies that are marketing quote unquote AI to schools now about what models they're using. Right? Are they using ChatGPT? Are they using 3.5? Are they using 4? There's a huge difference between the two. We just don't know. Or they're using some LLM which is running on their stupid phone and just they're claiming it's AI and it's it's what it is. You know, GPT 2.0. How will we ever know? And so it's those kinds of issues that worry me more. But the fact that those are biased, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised at all. I mean, I am biased, I know that. Yeah, I do the, you do that implicit bias test online. All of us are. But what we try to do, what we aspire for is a critical look back at oneself, hope that you're in a community which calls you out when you mess up, that I have the humility to accept that, and I have the grace to give to another when they transgress, all of that. This creature doesn't get any of that. That's what makes it, I think, a little troubling. All right? Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much to Punya Mishra. That was so inspiring. I can't wait to have more discussions about this. And if we can advance to the day slides, yeah. We have a fabulous workbook that Vital Sources put together, and Kathy Profitko did a fantastic job with this. They're one of our silver sponsors, and again, we want to thank all of our sponsors for making this conference happen. And another thing that we have experimented with this year is, in addition to the workbook, we're trying a conference app. So that is on Miro, and let's see if I can work this thing. There we go. So there is a QR code here up on the screen. It's also in the Google Drive folder. There are some instructions in there about using Miro if you've never used it before. We had considered on the conference committee having a conference app, but what we like about Miro is that it's very interactive and collaborative. So if you follow this link, you can just view and comment on the Miro board, or you can create an account and you can actually add post-it notes and things like that to it. So the QR code is still up on the screen there, and when you get there, you'll get this little introduction to the Miro board. We do have a bulletin board where you can post questions or ideas or rides to the airport or any resources that you have. We have a schedule with the links to each session, and then there is a separate frame for every single presentation at the conference here, so you can feel free to start dropping some of your ideas. I bet Punya brought up lots of things that you're thinking about that are going to come back to you later today or next week. Feel free to drop them on the board and respond to other people too. So Miro can be a little bit confusing to navigate because it is such a big canvas. So I would suggest using the little frame button that's at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, whether you're on the mobile version or you're on your laptop. And there is a navigation that will pop up that lets you go through each frame. There is a frame for every single session in the conference in here. There is also, I wanted to remind you, actually I'll go back one more second if anyone still wants to capture that QR code. There is a short screencast video there in the announcements about how to navigate around the Miro board if you've never used Miro before. And then I do want to remind you about session evaluations. We talked so much in the yesterday and today about how important data is. And this data about the sessions at the conference are really important to us. So you'll see this QR code outside of every room. So please take some time. You don't have to do it after every single session. You might do it at a break or at lunch or at the end of the day and do a couple of them in a row. But we really appreciate your input on the sessions. That just helps us to make the conference even better. Like, can it get any better than it is already? And we also have a folder here where you can share your photos in our Google Drive because there's a lot of great things going on here. So we've got a break for a few minutes, and then we've got some concurrent sessions. So we're in rooms 1, 2, and 3 down this hall here, and then 7 and 8, not using room 6. So that will be 10:30 to 11:30. And then we'll have a little bit earlier lunch, and the lunch will be back here in the ballroom again. And we'll have another hour and a half long time so that you can have some time to explore the posters, the showcases. So these are all the ones, they'll all be in the ballroom today. So they'll be set up around the edge of the room. I encourage you to come up and chat with the people. I'll be having a poster, and I'd love to geek out over my research with you. And then I'll come back at 1 o'clock to remind us to move on to the next session, and I'll explain how the exploration stations work then. All right, so go grab your coffee and head off to your next session. Thanks.